Well, welcome, Wanda, to our little chat show. It's really nice to have you here. We've spoken a couple of times, and I'm really excited about today's conversation. I think there's a whole angle to autism in the business place that people don't consider, and when it comes to inclusivity. And I think the audience is going to really benefit from your journey, both as a person with lived experience, but also as a professional, successful, and looking at helping other people understand what diversity and inclusion really is about. And we do a lot of that, and we talk all the time about the autism advantage for business, and the return on disability, as Rich would say, and the really the business case piece. But bottom line is, people don't work with us just because our people are good. They work with us because they want to help people, and they're interested in truly diversifying their workforce. So, as you know, I have a child on the spectrum who was diagnosed very young. That was not your experience. And I think I'd like to start there and just talk a little bit about your journey from where you were to where you are now, because I don't think everyone will know that story.
Sure. Well, pleased to share. And thanks, Gareth. Thanks for the opportunity. And thanks for those kind words that you shared at the top. And yes, journey is a way to describe it. So sometimes people ask me, you were diagnosed with autism at midlife. Didn't you know you were different? And what I say is that, yes, I did know I was different. And my family was different. We were a large family. I'm the youngest of 10. And I grew up in a very well-educated family. And some of the other things that set us apart, for instance, was that both my parents were strong advocates for equality, especially gender equality. So from as long as I can remember, I do recall being different from my peers. However, what was challenging and unfortunate is that I struggled socially, and in ways I struggled academically as well. And so looking back now, I realize what I was doing was I was masking my autism. And so I changed and adapted my behaviors to help me fit in better with my peers. And this worked to a degree. And you mentioned the term journey. And so I moved through school and I entered university, and I noticed this wide range in my marks followed me, and but I settled more socially through university, and I started a career, and I got married and had children. And then perhaps our listeners might be most interested in my time when I hit midlife, because we began to move around as a family beginning in 2011, around the time shortly after I turned 40. And I can only describe this as a time of complete upheaval from, say, 41 to 45. And then we moved again as a family. And this is the period that really set me into what I describe as a mental health crisis. And my mental health did hit a crisis point in the spring of 2017. And our younger son had been diagnosed with autism the first year that we had relocated. And then our younger son was diagnosed, and maybe I said our younger son, I meant our older son was diagnosed with autism a year after we relocated. And our younger son was diagnosed in the spring of 2017. And the day after we received his diagnosis, I had a previously scheduled doctor's appointment. And I said to my family physician, I'd like my own psychological assessment. I think I have it too. And what I think might be really helpful for our listeners to know is that there was always this duality, and perhaps they've already plugged into some of that. I had a career, I was married, had a family, we were able to relocate and have these great experiences outwardly. Inward, there was always this other story. And I've shared a bit of it, through my youth and in terms of the academic realm. However, in terms of my career, I struggled too, but that would not always be obvious to some people. Some people met me and they thought This was it. What they saw was what they got, and I was very successful. They didn't know how much at times I was struggling internally. And then, as I mentioned, when we started moving around, it was especially difficult because I was meeting so many people for the first time.
Right.
And that can be challenging for anyone, relocating from a rather settled environment where you've lived for a long time and you have a network and people take you at face value. Add autism to that, add undiagnosed autism to that. And there are a lot of challenges. There's so much more I could share, Garth, but I hope those are some highlights that are helpful for people.
In that space, how did you cope?
When I was finding it challenging?
Yeah, like with the stressors, because so many people on the spectrum really struggle with that exact thing, and you didn't have the understanding. So how did you process that pre-diagnosis? Like, what was that like for you?
A number of ways. I internalized a lot. So I took things very personally. And that's one thing that I stopped doing after I received my diagnosis, was personalizing everything, that everything was me, everything was my fault. So on the one hand, I did that, and I guess you could look at that as a negative. However, there were always positives. And that's something that, if listeners are hearing that, that recurring theme emerge, well, that was definitely what recurred in my life. So on the one hand, there are always challenges, and I would personalize everything. And then on the other hand, how did I deal with things? By getting support and feedback from my great network. And that's been a constant in my life, is that I've always had the best family, friends, peers, network members that anyone could ever imagine. In fact, when I would get worked up and I would appear really unsettled, sometimes my husband would say, "Wanda, you have the best people in your life you could ever imagine. Why do you get upset over these things? Why do these things bother you?" I didn't have perspective.
Right.
I let things occupy too much of my mind and gain too much importance. And of course, I'm sharing this all with you, Garth, through a rear view mirror.
Right, of course.
It's all hindsight. When you're going through it, obviously, it's difficult. It's difficult to see that perspective. And sometimes I would say to my husband, "You are right. Why am I?" But I could always push it back for a short time and never for long enough. Things would re-enter my mind. They would re-enter the fore. Now, of course, through my diagnosis and all the management techniques I have that have come through that, I'm much better able to cope.
Yeah. So there's two things that have come up while you've been talking. I'd really like to talk about, come back to the support network piece, because I think there's some things that you've learned that we've learned that are super helpful for everyone, not just people on the spectrum. But very often when people get a diagnosis of autism for their child, you'll commonly hear how hard it was, what a painful experience it was, and all of those pieces. But quite often, when you talk to someone like yourself, who as an adult received the diagnosis, it's a completely opposite experience. And I've heard terms like liberating, defining, freeing. Obviously, it was very helpful for you. What was the turning point, the tipping point, the balance change for you when that happened in your life?
Well, the immediate response to the psychologist who gave me the diagnosis was, "It's a relief." I always thought I was stupid. And that is to signify putting together all these pieces that I was never able to fully put together. So it was a relief. It was liberating. And that's why my firm is named Liberty Co., to signify that confronting the facts brings you freedom. And that's true in so many ways. It's not only my diagnosis. However, my diagnosis is a big part of it. Something that was really key for me, and it was in fact transformative, was that I began to look at things through a new prism. So to go back and needle some of the points of our conversation so far, I had always personalized everything. Everything was my fault. Wanda, anything that happened, it was your fault. And then I began to process my diagnosis. And of course, Gareth, I take full responsibility. I did cause conflict. I caused conflict in the workplace. I caused conflict within my family. I caused conflict with friends. And I regret that. And I spent a lot of time going back and sharing with people and walking through and learning. And so I take responsibility first and foremost for everything, but everything wasn't my fault.
Right.
And so when I say I began to look at things through a new prism, I realized, no, Wanda, starting in childhood, the bullying and the mistreatment, no, that was completely inappropriate for you and for anyone.
Right. Totally.
Neurodivergent, neurotypical,
Yeah.
disabled, able, that's inappropriate for anyone. Wanda, not everything in the workplace was your fault. Yes, there were things that you did cause for the center. And of course, I'm very different now in my interactions, and I've learned, but everything was not your fault. And there were things that were completely and totally inappropriate. And then I noticed that I spoke up for myself in ways that I'd never spoken up for myself before, because I thought everything was my fault. And that was not well received in every case. And I believe that if I'd known myself and I was self-aware and I had spoken up for myself earlier, well, I don't believe some of the things would have happened because I would not have been as vulnerable. And I believe, therefore, that I was a target. And we know this. We know if we read about workplaces, schoolyards, sports teams, any environment, unfortunately, vulnerabilities are detected. And people with vulnerabilities are targeted. And in fact, it's really sad. They can be exploited. And so I don't want people to hear Wanda got her diagnosis a month before her 47th birthday and everything was great.
Right.
She picked up that piece of her brain that was missing. She put it in place and everything was great. It was great and it was liberating. And it's great every day. When something that's significant happens in your life at such an advanced age, it's altering.
Yeah.
And you need to process and move onward accordingly.
And you have a lot of retrospective work to do, to redefine how things were, how you saw things, to see yourself. Because what I hear you saying, so many people say, I don't want to get a diagnosis of autism because I don't want a label. But what I hear you saying is actually is almost an enable, not a label, because it helped you understand yourself. It helped you understand what people had done to you, and it gave you context for setting yourself within the milieu of life. And you were able to say, that's not okay, this is okay, in a way that you didn't before. Because the way lots of people on the spectrum work, they need that kind of logical analysis, and it helps, right?
Yeah, it's definitely liberating. I understand now that I have a different brain makeup.
Exactly.
So from you, Garth, if you are indeed neurotypical, I have a different brain makeup. So I'm better able to understand now, okay, Wanda, perhaps that's your autism. Perhaps that's presenting as your autism. This is not autism. This is you seeking the same rights as any individual. This is that. And I'm not trying to come across like I spend my day compartmentalizing. However, it really helps me understand. And I guess to get right down to it, it's two things. I'm so much more self-aware. People treat me differently. Because I'm self-aware, I really notice that people treat me differently. I don't present with that same vulnerability. And it's great. On the other hand, it's made me much more empathetic. And so I'm very sensitive when I hear about misconduct and bullying and harassment. And I am very sensitive when I hear the stories of other people coming forward. And I'm not just talking about people with autism, although I do hear that, and those across the spectrum of neurodiversity. I'm talking about anyone who comes forward. And I think, Oh, that's really unfortunate, because not only did you have that experience, the person who targeted you saw some kind of vulnerability because they picked you and not someone else. And so what can we do? There's always so much we can learn and we can apply about diversity and inclusion and equity and accessibility right across,
Mhm.
not just for underrepresented groups, but right across. That's good for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. And that sort of brings me to the other point that came up earlier that I'd like to explore with you a little bit. In our work, we have a very structured approach to support for both our clients, we being neurotypical or neurodivergent, and our colleagues who work with us. And a part of that process is a very intentional support structure for both groups of people. An understanding, introduction, understanding of who am I, who is Wanda, and what is Wanda going to be like when she comes to work here, and how does Wanda, perceive things, and we use a variety of tools to do that. And then for the client, this is what autism is, this is what being neurotypical is, and so on. And then there's daily and weekly, behind the scenes mostly, but support structures that we find our clients end up replicating for everyone on their team. Because, our head of employment coordination, which is what we call the team that does this, says everyone needs a coach in life. Everyone needs that understanding. And, I have certainly benefited from it since we began this thing 8 years ago. And I'm just wondering, sort of in your work with people, and I want to explore with you your whole concept around real inclusion and real diversity, because it's really interesting, and it's something that I think is very thought-provoking. We need to talk about that too. But in your work, how do you find that translates? So, like, obviously you're working with people like yourself who have been diagnosed later in life, or who have other diversities and other pieces, and you're helping everyone find that context and that understanding. How do you frame it so that people can actually listen to you? Because the one challenge we have often with our clients is they think that this is for somebody who's a bit broken, who needs a little bit of extra help. And they don't mean to be patronizing or condescending at all. It's ignorance, basically. And I'm just interested, coming from your perspective, because you're coming from it from a different angle than I would be. And I'm curious how you see that and how that works as you work with people.
That's a great point. There's so much I could say, I guess, to zero in by practicing it. So, for instance, when do I flourish as an autistic person? When there's open, honest, trusting, clear, and straightforward communication. So I try to practice that when I'm in touch with people, make things clear, straightforward. When we're speaking, whether it's virtually or in whatever format, being really straightforward and honest, so the person isn't spending time second guessing or trying to read between the lines. That can be challenging for folks on the spectrum like myself. So first and foremost, practicing it. And then what I notice is that people adapt and adopt what works. So what I'm noticing is that groups that I'm working with are practicing straightforward, open, honest, two-way communication. And what's really interesting is when you think about the things that autism advocates or disability generally advocates have been championing for years or even decades through workplace accommodation, and have been turned down because they were foreseen as too expensive or too inconvenient to implement, a lot of those things were put in place overnight due to COVID, when a large part of our workplace had to move home. So what did I need in the workplace? Straightforward, open communication, sometimes customized communication with my supervisor to really play to my strengths. Flexibility, it sometimes to really, again, play to my strengths when I could be most productive. What were the things that were put in place overnight that are found to be benefiting everyone? More open communication, in some cases, customized communication, especially with supervisors, flexibility.
Mm.
So these are examples of things that, again, would have been valuable years ago, are put in place because of COVID. And now everyone is benefiting. And I shouldn't say everyone, because
Right.
there's always cases, there's always people who want to go back to the way things were. However, what we're hearing is very positive.
Mm-hmm. It's totally true.
So practice what you believe in, demonstrate it. It might not take root overnight. Stick with it, and it may over the longer term. Don't ask people to do what you wouldn't do yourself. So if you want that kind of communication, you need to adhere to it, and maintain an open mind, and learn from others, and learn from other environments and applications, and good things will happen.
What I love, Wanda, about what you're saying is you're really not talking about what other people should do. You're talking about what I do and providing people with context, the reason behind what you do, which really leads to understanding, right? And that approach is quite refreshing, because it's in our work, you often come across a lot of people who really want to do good, but they're telling people what they should do and why they should do it. And it's kind of externalized. You have come at it from a completely internalized perspective, which is empowering for anyone, because anyone can listen to you. They can hear it because it's not threatening.
And something that's really, really important, Garth, and is a passion of mine, perhaps you've picked this up, my online content, is inclusive leadership. So I say, from the boardroom to the C-suite to the office cubicle, neurodiverse talent can thrive and flourish when our abilities are played to and match with organizational goals and objectives. And when we look at inclusive hiring strategies, they've been more at the office cubicle level than the boardroom and the C-suite.
Right.
And of course, you're not going to have everyone in the boardroom and the C-suite. There's, for instance, one CEO and there's an executive team, and it's usually much smaller than the rest of the employee body. And I certainly understand that. However, we can perform at all levels, and we have the right to perform at all levels. And when you look at any historically marginalized group, it's been the same. In the workforce, it's not been generally in the boardroom and the C-suite. It's been at the office cubicle. And when you look at COVID, it tells us it's been frontline workers. And we're learning, and it's taken far too long, but from Black Lives Matter, Indigenous reconciliation, LGBTQ2+ rights, everyone needs to see different folks at different levels, and that includes at the highest levels, and of course it includes it in the middle management area. However, it can't just be in entry positions, contract, most precarious. And in terms of autistic hiring and neurodiversity, that's often where it's been. And so thanks for acknowledging, Garth. I am being heard. I believe it is a responsibility I have because of my privilege. I've held senior divisional leadership positions, and along with that goes with privilege and responsibility. And so I'm sharing my story because I want to give people reason for hope and optimism that, like other previously marginalized groups, autistics are going to hold some of the most senior leadership positions. We can do it.
Oh, I 100% agree with that. Actually, we joke internally all the time how if we were able to plunk ourselves back down here 100 years from now, it will be neurodivergent people running the planet, because we're creating a world that is perfectly suited for their gifts. And I honestly believe that. I mean, I just work with some of the most amazing humans who are so good at what they do, who never had the runway to do it before. And it's just, it's awesome to see. One of the things in listening to your online presentations before, reading and talking with you the last time, one of the things that really struck me was that you really don't just push neurodiversity in your work. You push inclusion. And, you know, it really, we had this conversation, which maybe we can have another time, about how gender identity, sexuality, all that stuff in the neurodivergent community is actually incredibly healthy compared to the typical populace. But when you and I were talking, when you talk about inclusion, you're talking about all marginalized groups, and representative within them are people who are neurally divergent. And that's something that I haven't heard as a conversation very much yet. There's these silos around diversity that when you go into departments and they want to talk to you about, well, we have this many targets for this hire and we have this many targets for this. And I mean, maybe not that literal, but that's part of the agenda. You mess with all that.
I do. I love it for so many reasons. So intersectionality, we could you and I could take a university course dedicated to this. So nothing we're going to cover in a few minutes, but first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer and activist out of the US, intersectionality. So considering all those various aspects of individual identity, and some of which you've mentioned, and they become especially important when power structures are in play. So for instance, my privilege as a white autistic woman, I have to be very aware of.
Right.
Because I have privilege that Black autistic women do not have. In fact, Black autistic women, Indigenous autistic women, and Indigenous women or autistic women of color experience barriers that I do not. So I have to be really aware of all that. Disability, and therefore within that neurodiversity, if we're going to talk for a moment about neurodiversity right within that disability community, runs across all other communities.
Right.
So I mentioned Black, Indigenous, of color. You mentioned sexual orientation, so run disability and neurodiversity through all sexual identities. And so that's one of the things that makes disability and neurodiversity fascinating, is that it runs across all races, ethnicities, religious groups, sexual orientation, gender identity, citizenship. And so that's really why I'm so passionate about neurodiversity and disability as dimensions of overall diversity. And that, of course, I always say it's never a matter of taking any away race. I would never take race, ethnicity, religion, any of those aspects. They're all crucially important. Right. It's a matter of adding disability and then within that neurodiversity.
Yeah, it's a very different way to approach it, because I don't think neurodiversity has been understood, or still is very understood within the population in general. And we have a long way to go with it. We often try to explain to customers, imagine if a person who looks like they're your average Canadian, so me, white male, Canadian, Western Canada, but imagine if I actually had an invisible cultural difference, had a different worldview, and I looked like everybody else, but my way of seeing the world is fundamentally different because of who I am, not because of where I was born or because of where I was raised. Then add to that no understanding of that, the expectation that I'm just supposed to want to walk into a room with 500 people and be happy to be there and sell myself in an interview and deal with all the bits and pieces, that my son specifically really struggles with in his life. And he doesn't so much anymore, but it took a lot of work. We have a long way to go to get to people to understand what this really is, because it's, there are disability factors that are associated with being neurally diverse, often comorbid conditions, but they're not anything to do with what autism is per se. And actually, all of our colleagues are really high functioning individuals on the spectrum. But it's an interesting challenge, because until you've walked in it, or until you make that personal connection, it's very difficult to understand.
Yeah, I generally don't refer to, say, high functioning or lower functioning, right, because those can be perceived as pejorative or heard as pejorative.
Totally.
What I focus more about is society is disabling. So it's not as much, I haven't been asked to enter a debate on is neurodiversity disability or not. I say it is disability. I say it is part of that huge 1.3 billion worldwide disability community. That is largely because societal barriers still exist. And as long as those societal barriers exist, we're going to be looking at disability, and I look at it that way. Again, it goes back to, if we could break down those barriers it wouldn't just benefit the disability population, it would benefit so many people.
Totally.
Because those same barriers in thinking, you say, I rally around inclusion generally, even though I focus on disability and neurodiversity, I never say one's more important than the other.
Right.
It's because those barriers to full inclusion affect all of us and are detrimental to all of us, whether they're based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, or ability. And so, yes, I want to tear them all down. I don't know if I'll do that in my lifetime. I'd love to see that. We still have a long way to go, as you just mentioned. However, what's good for one person has much wider benefit for everyone.
Totally.
So yes, I would love those racial constructs that are yes, I'd love to see them torn down. I'd love to see the barriers around gender constructs. I'd love to see those torn down. And it is that wider sense of inclusion that I am working towards. Yes, thanks for recognizing that.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, no, I thank you for what you're doing, Wanda. You know, we're on the same journey, and I really feel there's been no better time to be involved in this work. And the fact that, like, even when we first began 10 years ago, it was mostly neurotypicals talking about neurally divergent people. I mean, you had a few exemplars out there. Ultimately, it's not our story. And, you know, I'm not really sure if I'm on the spectrum or not. I have suspicions. Apples don't fall far from trees. But I think the journey is one that we want to share. And we thank you for sharing your journey. We may not see the end of this journey in our lifetime, but we have to start. And we are making tremendous progress. And it is the story of people on the spectrum coming into their own, finding their way, and helping and being brave enough to share that with people, because it's not exactly in for many of our colleagues at all in their wheelhouse to even ever want to talk about this stuff. They just want to live, but they're choosing to work with us because they want to make a difference. They're not just working with us because we're a company. They're very brave, and you know, it's very humbling at times to see the stuff that I just take for granted them hunker down and do. It's awesome. So thanks for today.
I'm often asked a word or a piece of advice to share. And so I'll offer that to you in case it's helpful for our listeners, and that is believe. It's just one word. It's very powerful because I didn't believe in myself, because I didn't know myself. And again, I feel this can apply, and I've been told it is helpful, not just for autistics, not just for neurodiverse population, although of course we're important. That word can be important for anyone. So believing yourself, even when the doubt creeps in, and it will, and it does, believing yourself, and find one person who believes in you. And it's great to have more, and I'm really fortunate I have more than one. However, find that one person you can always go back to. So when you're doubting yourself and that little voice, the negative voice creeps in, that one person you can always go to who will give you a shot in the arm.
We all need that one person. It's good to have that person, isn't it? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Garth. This has been great.